3. Chapter 2. The Days of Youth. He morning of May 27, 1836, had been a very memorable time in the Gould family. The daughters were informed by the father that they had a dear little brother. What an event was this in a household where there were already 5 little girls. One of Mr. Gould's eldest sisters has often said, "I remember but as though yesterday my great delight. The first opportunity, one stole into my mother's room to see if what had been told me was really true. Sure enough, in the cradle, with a wealth of brown hair and dark eyes, lay our little treasure. We all thought him very wonderful, and watched with great fondness from day to day his growth and development. The first tooth, as usual, was looked for with great interest, and when he was 9 months old, the whole house was overjoyed at his feat of walking and climbing the stairs. It is not necessary to say that with 5 older sisters he was the pet and idol of the household. His baby pranks and precocious sayings were repeated to all who would patiently listen. Our grandmother's especial gratitude for a boy was that the name might go down to future generations. Father 36. The Days of Youth. Rejoiced in the prospect of one to help him bear his burdens, and become, as he had done, an inheritor of the paternal acres. Mother accepted the treasure as a new responsibility, fraught with much anxiety for the future. His first 4 years were uneventful, save in the home circle, years not particularly calculated to bring out the strong points of his character. Being frail and delicate, he was all the more petted and generally had Lee's own way. When he entered his 5th year, all were anxious for him to begin his education, and his mother consented to his name being registered as a pupil in the little country school. His first day was an eventful one, as described under the chapter devoted to incidents and anecdotes. The next day was a success at school. When fully initiated, he took great delight in his studies, always keeping in advance of his class. It was only by taking plenty of exercise out of doors, riding, driving, and running over the hills and mountains that his physical nature was able to endure the strain of his intense study after he became older. Before he was 5 years old the sweet, gentle mother left that household for the better land, the greatest loss a little, delicate child could possibly have. The only memory he had of her, as he has since said during the latter years of his life, was the messenger summoning him from school in order that she might give him her dying blessing, and he never forgot how cold her lips were when she gave 28 life of Jay Gould him her last kiss of love, but he could not know how hard it was for a fond mother to leave her youngest born. He inherited from his mother his ambition, his sweet and gentle nature, that evenness of temper which enabled him to control himself even when a boy and still more when he became a man, and also his wonderful ability to turn everything to his financial profit. From his father he inherited his indomitable will, his persistent perseverance to accomplish whatever he undertook, no matter what obstacles came in his way, and from him also he had a most sympathetic nature. He shrank from sufferings he could not alleviate. His first 3 years in school were in a little old schoolhouse, grey with age and tottering with its infirmities. But at that time the anti-rent war broke out in New York State, and for some time the Gould home was in the midst of civil strife. Jay's father represented law and order itself. Mobs of armed and disguised men could not drive him from his position, but they did drive his children from the public school. After a threat to drown his boy, then 8 years old, which frightened him greatly, he declared he should never enter that school again. The result was a new comfortable building called Beechwood Seminary, with graduates from the State Normal School at Albany as its professors. They were men fitted for their calling, and knew just how to lure their young student onward in the days of youth. Paths that led up the hill of science. This opportunity he improved to its fullest extent. His progress was a continual delight to his instructors. He would never accept assistance in working out hard problems. He was known to have worked at times for 3 weeks on a difficult problem in logarithms. When he gained the victory, the whole house was made aware of the fact by a succession of somersaults and kindred demonstrations. He was so studious that he almost always spent his evenings with his sisters, yet sometimes he would join a party for coasting by moonlight and such other outdoor sports as belonged to the country. One day he and one of his young companions decided on a rare treat. He had a young colt which was his own property, so he very naturally concluded he had a right to its services. The slaying was good, and his father absent from home, so they thought it a most excellent time to try the speed of the young, untrained horse. They succeeded in arranging a Single harnessed to their entire satisfaction, the colt was put before a new beautifully painted coaster large enough for the two boys. They took their places with great anticipation, they gathered up the reins, and were soon gliding down the inclined driveway quickly led to the main road. The beautiful bay arched his neck, and to the consternation of the boys refused to be governed by bit and reins. He sped onward with ever-increasing speed until finally he conceived the idea of lifting his hind feet. AQ Life of Jay Gould. In a very violent manner. The boys were thoroughly frightened, and concluding that retreat at that juncture would be the better part of valor, slipped off, willing to leave the post of danger. The pet animal dashed furiously onward until he was stopped by a neighbor, who readily divined what had happened. He brought the colt to its stall, rubbed it down, gathered up the broken sled, and put everything in as good a condition as possible for Mr. Gould's homecoming. The time when he should know what had happened was very much dreaded, but when the fact did finally become known, he was so grateful for the miraculous escape of the boys that he did not even scold, but thought he had better consider the colt his own property. Tim's ended the episode. Young Jay's first visit to New York about this time was a very memorable event. His father, having business which would detain him for some days, thought it a favorable opportunity to introduce his youthful son to some of the wonders of the great city. His trip down the Hudson was a surprise and a delight, but when the city opened up before him with its many streets, its huge blocks of brick, stone, and marble, its fountains and tall spires, its beautiful shops filled with so much, attract the eye of a child that had never seen beyond the mountains that encircled his native valley, he was simply bewildered. The story of Aladdin and his wonderful lamp was verified. His sister waited anxiously for the days of youth. His return, wondering what he would have to tell them, but to their disappointment he was more quiet than usual, until he had had time to think over and arrange in his own mind the incidents of his visit. He then told them many very wonderful things. His unpleasant experience with an untamed colt did not detract from his love of driving horses that were subject to bit and bridle. Before he was 12 years of age he was allowed to drive a pair of fleet-footed, spirited greys, that often felt their oats, up and down the hills and over the mountains for the convenience of his sisters. He never boasted of any inventive ability, but it was always sufficient to meet any emergency. Once while driving through Grand Gorge, a narrow pass between two mountains, the horses for some reason sprang to one side, breaking the tongue of the carriage. What was to be done was the next question. After a moment's consideration, he left one of his sisters in charge of the reins while he went to the nearest house and borrowed an axe with which he cut a young sapling, and with the help of a rope he mended the break and journeyed on. All went well until he crossed the bridge at Stratton Falls and began to ascend the hills up to the old farm. All at once the carriage began to move in the wrong direction. It was just above a roaring cataract. Realizing the danger, he sprang from the carriage as quick as thought and blocked the wheels. Then 42 Life of Jay Gould. Turning the horses at right angles with the road. With a command to them to stand still, he mended up a second time. After all the delays his sisters congratulated themselves that they had reached home before any scouts had been sent out to look for them. One of Mr. Gould's sisters, who was much with him in his youth, has said, "We frequently had what we considered hair-breadth escapes, of which the following was an example. We had decided to visit one of our maternal uncles who lived on the Delaware River near Deposit. We left home very early one beautiful June morning, our horse was fresh and our carriage light, and we almost flew over the beautiful country until we reached Delhi, 20 miles from home, thence down to Walton, and by way of a plank road for the mountain to Shehockton. After leaving there we learned that the very rain which had made the country so charming in its freshness and so fragrant with its flowers, had carried away an important bridge, and that we would have to ford the river. We hesitated, but were told if we kept the track there was no danger. Instead of a heavy freighted wagon we were in a light buggy. We followed the track as directed, but found the water much deeper than we anticipated. It came up into the carriage, the horse seemed to be losing his footing, and as we gazed at the rushing waters it looked to us as if we were going down more than across the river. Girl-like, we were. The days of YOUTJF. 4. Alarmed and wanted to turn back, all our brother said was, "Girls, do not say one word, keep perfectly quiet, and I will take you over safely." The tone and manner were sufficient. He touched the horse lightly with his whip, she plunged forward until she reached the other shore. As soon as we were on dry ground our escort remarked, though he was very pale, his lips even colorless, "I would not have been afraid if you girls had not been with me." Young Gould never enjoyed working for small returns, even in the days of his boyhood. A pleasant task of one of his sisters was to go out in the summer mornings while the grass and bushes were still glistening with dew to gather the luscious wild berries that grew around the stumps and along the fences of the farm. Jay was usually her companion. He would whistle away in a merry mood as long as he found plenty of fruit to lure him on, skipping around from one clump of bushes to another, until he had been over the whole ground, then informing his sister that there were no more worth remaining. For, away he would go, leaving her to do the gleaning. He was often surprised at the contents of her basket. He could not see where she found them, but greatly admired her patient perseverance. He was born with an ability to turn things to good account financially. In all his little purchases when a boy he had a plan arranged for the disposition of a property before making the purchase. A life of Jay Gould. Unless he wished to retain it, just as in after years, when an opportunity offered for the purchase of a railroad he considered well the necessity for such a road, and the value it would be to the public or to himself as an investment before making the venture. This characteristic was one great feature in his financial success. His reticence in regard to his own plans was the same among his school companions and at home as in after years with men of business. The winter of 1848 was marked by a widespread religious movement, which was felt in many parts of our country. It reached young Jay's native mountain-bound village. The Methodist Church, of which his sisters were members, caused the enthusiasm, and held a series of meetings. Among those who were deeply impressed was Jay, who gave his name to the CHNRCH, but afterward felt his mother's church, the Presbyterian, was the church of his choice. 2 years later, at the age of 14, he secured a pew in that church and placed himself under the gospel care of the Reverend W. E. Taylor, between whom and himself there was begun a lifelong friendship. He saw much in the boy which led him to prophesy great things in the future, and he felt, as he has said, only a few years since, that he had not been disappointed in the greatness of his achievements. When age and infirmity crept over the old pastor, rendering him unfit for the care of an important charge, he was fortunately called to the days of Ydouth. A.C. Elmsford, a little church near Lyndhurst, the county seat of his once young parishioner, who had in the meantime arisen to wealth and position. Mr. Gould did not forget the old pastor, for he was welcome at his home, and had the freedom of his conservatories, where he could enjoy the study of plants from every clime. It is safe to say his purse was not often empty nor his purse carried unsupplied, and when the time came that he could not even serve that church and had to vacate the parsonage he was furnished a home free of charge. The old pastor still lives to speak of his benefactor. When Jay was 13 he became very tired of farm life. It was too slow, too monotonous, too hard for his slight physique, the returns were too uncertain. All these things stimulated him to greater effort for a more extended education. Often when deep in the midst of some intricate problem he would see father coming in, as he knew, for him to do some errand or piece of work. He would slip into some hidden corner, book and slate in hand, and a hush, girls, on his lips until his father, despairing of finding him, would make other arrangements. Then with his conscience a little tender he would say, "It is too bad, but I must study, you know." When he had completed the course of study at home he greatly desired to go elsewhere, and had decided on the Hobart Seminary, 9 miles from home. A distance he thought he could easily walk on Saturday, returning Sunday evening to be ready to answer. 5 Life of Jay Gould. The roll call on Monday morning, he realized that father, from the small returns from his farm, could not afford to pay his bills. He decided he could and would pay them himself. It has previously been related how he gained admittance to Hobart Seminary. His father was a positive man, and when he said no to one of his girls it was considered final. But not so with our youthful hero. He would, without seeming to be discomfited at all, make some strategic move and, prepared with new arguments, would bring the matter before the House for reconsideration, and if this did not bring the desired result the bill would come up for a third reading, and so on until the victory was won. In this way he gained permission, his father saying to him, "I do not know, but you might as well go, for it is certain you will never make a farmer." His sisters thought he might make a lawyer, and were sure if time was given him he would always gain his point. He made his weekly visits home, as he proposed, until he completed his course. During this time his father was considering what he could do that would give his son more congenial employment. He decided he would have to leave the old farm, notwithstanding everything connected with it was very dear to him. It was the place where his father and mother had lived and where he was born. Many of the fruit trees were from trees from his own plant. He had nursed and cared for them, in his own boyhood, the shade trees with their broad the days of youth. Y. Is spreading branches, scattered here and there to protect the flocks and herds from the scorching sun and the pelting storm, the trout brook, the maple grove, the spring of luscious water, all were dear with memories of the past, but as he had to choose between leaving them or letting his son go from the household, the choice was soon made and the farm was exchanged for the hardware business of A.H. Burhans & Co. When Jay came from his school he at once entered this store as a clerk until father took possession and put him in charge, as was related in the preceding chapter. Very soon after he made him general manager and a partner in the business. He did all the purchasing and kept the books for the firm. He did not drop his studies, but rose early and sat up late in order that he might have time to devote to them and to a self-directed course of reading. His reading was not so much for recreation as for improvement, consequently he read standard works as far as his limited purse would allow their chase. By this study and the use of instruments, obtained from Mr. E. I. Burhans, he became in the next few years a practical surveyor, not an inventor, as has often been said of him. Even the wonderful mousetrap, which has so often been ascribed to him, was the invention of his maternal grandfather, who had seen nearly 80 years, and who, with his failing mental vision, looked upon it as something very wonderful. G. Life of J. Gould. The hardware business did not occupy all of young Gould's time. He began to feel he could accomplish more by going out from home, for the resources of the village and surrounding country were too limited for his ambition. He entrusted for once his thoughts and plans to his sisters, and they sympathized with him, but pleaded with him to remain at home for their sakes and for his father's sake as well as his own. He argued he could make all the purchases for the firm and that his father was perfectly able to do the rest. He did not feel that his living should come out of Lather's purse. It was enough for him to take care of his girls. A boy should take care of himself. The question naturally arose, if he left home what did he propose to do? Then he divulged to his sisters a surveying scheme for the purpose of making a map of Ulster County. He had received a proposition, he had looked the ground all over, in fact, had, in his own mind, decided to accept it, but did not want to go without his father's sanction. Therefore he wanted to enlist his sisters in his favor, that they might help to plead his cause, as he had not yet entered his 16th year, and to the family he seemed a mere boy, although he had been doing the work of a man, making purchases for the business for 2 years of such firms as Phelps, Dodge & Co., in New York City, and Ransom, Rapon & Co., in Albany. He had just returned from one of his trips to Albany and crossed the Hudson River on cakes of floating ice which did not have the effect to assure the days of youth. His father and sisters that his venturesome spirit might not take him into some greater danger. His arguments, however, prevailed, and in a few days his arrangements were made. He could not at that time draw much from his small capital which was needed in the business, so he left home with $5 in his pocket, expecting that the company would furnish him means for his support. He entered immediately upon his duties, found them laborious, but congenial. The reason they were congenial was because he saw they looked to something higher. The young surveyor progressed satisfactorily until his employer became suddenly embarrassed and unable to pay, but with his intuitive foresightedness he had retained a copy of all his surveys, and he at once concluded to take matters in his own hands and publish the map himself. Of his little stock of money he had only 10 cents left, and that small piece he has never parted with. It was among his treasures till he died. How he was to meet the expense was a thing to be considered. He could not spare time to go to Roxbury. He was among strangers and consequently had no credit, but just when things were the darkest and failure of the project seemed inevitable, a new way of increasing his supplies providentially opened before him. The making of a noon mark, described in the preceding chapter, for which he received his dinner and 50 cents, was the avenue which led to success. The value of his noon marks preceded Life of Jay Gould him, and out of this new supply he paid all the expenses of the remaining surveys and came out with $6 in his pocket, and his labors were crowned with success. Gould's map of Ulster County was pronounced accurate in every detail, consequently he realized a very respectable sum from its sale. Soon after this we find the young man in Albany. While prospecting there he became associated with the late John Delafield in an application to the state legislature for aid in the completion of a topographical survey of the state of New York. Favorably progress was made, but before anything material was accomplished Mr. Delafield died. He at once abandoned the idea of legislative aid, but with characteristic pluck decided to prosecute the enterprise upon a more limited scale upon his own AC count. Accordingly during the summer of 1853, then in his 17th year, he completed his survey of Albany County, and during the ensuing winter he drafted out his surveys and produced a map which, on completion sold at a handsome profit. During the same summer, 1853, he was employed by the Cohoes Manufacturing Co. to survey and make a map of their village which netted him $600. In the same year he also surveyed and laid out the Albany and Muskie-Una Plank Road. This was a task which presented great difficulties to our Yumi surveyor. The practical calculation of grades, excavations, and embankments was an untried field. Jay Gould and Hamilton Burham. The days of youth. C. But he successfully mastered them all and completed his work to the entire satisfaction of the company, and was liberally rewarded. The amount of hard work accomplished by Gould in 1853 was almost incredible, and it may well be believed that he invariably rose long before daybreak and seldom retired to rest before midnight. In the spring of 1854 he returned to Albany, perfected his plans and business arrangements for the ensuing season. He did his drafting at home. Early in April he sent a surveyor into Delaware County, New York, for the purpose of taking surveys for a prospective map. He sent similar expeditions into Lake and Geauga counties, Ohio, and Oakwood County, Michigan. His personal attention was given to the drafting department, but he kept himself familiar with all the details of the business. Nothing escaped his notice. During the summer he usually traveled from point to point during the night, and such were his powers of endurance that only a few hours of rest would fit him for the next day. He kept the most vigilant watch over his employees, never giving them notice of his coming. Thanks to his iron constitution and his wonderful powers of endurance, he not only completed all the work he had mapped out for himself, but was able to devote 60 days during the summer to the survey of a proposed railroad from Newberry to Syracuse. It must be remembered that by this time he had a life of Jay Gould. Made himself a proficient practical engineer. The labors of the latter enterprise proved far more laborious than had been anticipated, but having undertaken the work he was determined to complete it, but he paid dearly for thus overtaxing himself. He completed the last profile of the proposed road, affixed his signature, and in 1 hour afterward was prostrated with typhoid fever. His illness was severe and his recovery slow. Engagements were pressing. An effort to resume business too soon brought on a violent relapse, followed by inflammation of the lungs. His physician thinks he never fully recovered his lung power from that attack. Feeling compelled to curtail his operations, he sold his interest in all surveys. While surveying Delaware County he had collected many facts of historical importance. He visited every old man and woman in the county. During his period of convalescence he felt the need of some employment for his active, restless mind. He set to work compiling his notes, and shortly afterward, at the age of 17, published the History of Delaware County, a well-written book of 450 pages, and far more valuable now if it could be obtained. With returning health he laid down the pen and picked up the implement of the engineer. While thus engaged his mind was attracted to the subject of tanning as a business more profitable than engineering. After mature deliberation he concluded to try his future in that line, as outlined in the Pract. The Days of Youth. Chapter. Some idea may be formed of the energy and ability displayed in this new enterprise from the fact that in lieu days from the time the first tree was felled the tannery was in full operation. At this juncture came the terrible panic of 1856, and while so many firms were swept out of existence, the foresight and financial ability of Gould, though scarcely 20 years of age, maintained the credit P.F. Pratt and Gould, and they weathered the gale in safety. They employed at one time 250 men and manufactured 1.5 million pounds of sole leather annually, yet Mr. Gould was not satisfied to remain in this narrow sphere. Tanning, like surveying, was only another step in the direction of his life's great work. He had had many opportunities of familiarizing himself with railroad maps which he had improved. He understood the geography of our country. He was possessed of valuable information regarding its agricultural and mineral resources, and took the deepest interest in all enterprises for facilitating communication between these different sections. He longed to connect himself with some kindred spirits who would aid in carrying out his great schemes. About this time the opportunity he had so long desired presented itself. The celebrated Schuyler frauds had caused railroad securities to decline to a nominal figure. The far-seeing young man invested all his capital and every dollar he could borrow and secured for himself the control of the Rutland and -6 life of Jay Gould, Washington, and Troy and Rutland RR. It was a daring venture, but proved profitable beyond his daring expectations. In less than 2 years he had succeeded in extricating the roads from their financial embarrassment and consolidating them with the Saratoga, Whitehall and Rensselaer RR. He closed his connection with that railroad to embark his operations in the Erie Railway, being the only man who behaved in the advisability of saving the property from bankruptcy and ruin and make it the principal business thoroughfare through the state. He met with opposition from such men as Drew and Vanderbilt. While they could not see a way out of the difficulties themselves, they were not willing to be guided by the vision of any other man, and especially one so youthful. He was financially prepared to accept the presidency, but difficulties more perplexing arose. He could not carry out the only plan which to him promised success. The narrow limits of his own loved state, and where he has always chosen to dwell, were too contracted for his gigantic schemes. His mission has been to open up the Great West and aid in developing its mining and agricultural interests which he dreamed of in his early years. For the last 20 years our youth, no longer young in experience, has planned and worked and used his capital to promote this object until he has seen 3 transcontinental lines of railroad and the great Missouri system extending north and south, with hamlets and towns. The days of youth. C7. Following in their wake where thousands and thousands of families, native-born, and from far shores, have found a place to call a home. The West and the East, brought so near together by the railroads and throbbing electric wire, are not strangers anymore. The West bows in reverence to the culture of the East, and the East looks in breathless astonishment upon the progress of the West. Thus have the dreams of his boyhood become real. He might have retired to his beautiful home on the banks of the Hudson many years ago and lived at his ease regardless of the needs of our great country, but he would have lost his identity. Forces within and without have urged him on. To think and formulate plans have seemed a necessity with Hina. Labor was rest, idleness would have been stagnation. Chapter 3.